Shannon Bechtel. I am the project lead. I am the quality lead at CMHA Waterloo, Wellington. And in the room with me, I have a few people from our project team. We have Julie Brazil and Sharon Fox, who are both referral coordinators, and we also have Stephanie Robinson, who is one of our adult services managers. Unfortunately, the other people weren't able to join us today, but that's our little team there on the slide. If you want to switch to the next one, I've included all our pictures. So we had a mix of frontline staff and some leadership. We also had some support from a client that provided a little bit of feedback, a family member, which was really great. And we can go to the next one. Okay, so we've been working on implementing the Health Quality Ontario standard around access to services. And so what we looked at was currently within adult intensive services, so we have what's called a FACT program, which is a flexible assertive community treatment team. Individuals that were there were long wait times for this service that would range anywhere from like 1 day to a year, 2 years, depending on the individual and what was going on at the time for them. So what we talked about as a team was that wait times for individuals with schizophrenia can have many negative consequences. So people's symptoms may increase, there may be a decline in their mental health, causing impacts on family, on themselves, on their entire life. So we wanted to look at how we can reduce that time and implement the schizophrenia standards, which I believe is 14 days, to access adult intensive services. So we currently have processes in place to review individuals for consideration for a priority status into service. But we kind of had to dig into that to figure out how that was working and kind of how we can use that prioritization to implement this standard for adults with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. Go to the next slide, please. So, next slide, please. There we go. So our problem statement was that wait time for adults, so ages 18 plus. Oh, yep, there we go. With a diagnosis of schizophrenia to receive adult intensive services are lengthy. So our median wait time was 57.5 days in Kitchener for the last 2 years. We want to implement the standards for schizophrenia care in the community across the agency. And we're also seeing a priority request for services that has increased over the last year or so. And currently, within the way our service works, a diagnosis of schizophrenia is not currently a priority request. It's not considered a priority request. So our aim is to reduce the time from referral to service initiation for adults with schizophrenia into FACT in Kitchener by a minimum of 10% by September 30th, 2019. And next, we dug into this by looking at our fishbone diagram. So we found there are about 4 root causes that were common among different areas. So the intake process, waitlist issues, skill level, and treatment matching and linking. So we found that a lot of times people who called in for services were put on multiple wait lists. Staff weren't necessarily sure what the right wait list was for them, what the right service was. And sometimes it was a matter of knowing that there's long wait times, so putting them on multiple wait lists, hoping to get them a service at some point quickly. We also found that there were often multiple diagnoses or conflicting diagnoses in the information that was coming in for clients. And then an understanding of the wait list and priorities. So understanding what kind of what would constitute a priority for somebody, and kind of how that person gets prioritized for adult services. So, for example, we prioritize individuals who have a community treatment order. We get them into service faster. So next slide, please. We also did our 5 whys, and then kind of drilling down. So we looked at defining the different understanding of priority between referral sources. So we have multiple people that could be sending in referrals: hospitals, community partners, family members, self-referrals, primary care. And there's been a different understanding of what a priority would be. So why that was is that there's a different criteria for each adult services program, even though it's a shared wait list. So I'm going to back up for 1 second here. Within our system, it gets a little complicated because we have a shared wait list for adult services among different organizations. So we have 2 other partner organizations that we share the wait list with that also offer adult intensive services. The challenge we've run into is we have this shared wait list, but all 3 organizations have different criteria for services. So we're putting multiple people on a shared wait list that don't necessarily have the same criteria. So that becomes a bit of a challenge. We found that our own internal services, the criteria has kind of shifted over time, over the last couple of years since we started FACT team. Different funding pieces and requirements have become involved, and that's kind of shifted what our criteria is. There have been different perspectives. So what's a crisis or a risk versus treatment, and what deserves a priority, and what kind of the system is looking at. We've also determined that triage is happening in sometimes multiple places, and that whole triage process didn't exist when it was initially set up. So we kind of drilled down to the failure to realign the process, our intake process, when we started this new intake role. So there were different ways of assessing an intake. Some people were getting more collateral than others, and we didn't align with the intake assessment, and that kind of ended up with multiple priority statuses. We also found another piece that we couldn't address, another root cause, which was a lack of leadership and community collaboration. So we have a system that doesn't have clear leadership or direction or accountability, which is something we are not able to address at this point. Oh, next slide, please. We did a process map, which you can see here is very colorful. We kind of have 2 pieces to our intake process. We have like a coordinated access piece, which is the yellow stickies. And then they get put on a wait list, and then there's a secondary process that happens, which is the purple stickies, which is where our intake, our referral coordinators come into play. So that's kind of what our messy little process map looks like. If we can move to the next slide, please. So our kind of key root causes that we came up with after going through our diagnostic tools was a failure to realign our referral or intake process when the FACT intake role started. So we implemented this new role, but we didn't actually change the intake process itself. And then the other root cause that we came up with was that the diagnosis was not actually identified at the time of the referral, which makes it difficult for us to try and prioritize somebody if we don't actually know that they have a diagnosis of schizophrenia. If you move to our next slide, this is our project charter. So you can look at the slides afterwards. I'm not going to read through this for you. But our big things were looking at some change ideas, which I'll talk about a little bit more detail, but looking at screening the referrals that are coming in on a weekly basis for a diagnosis of schizophrenia, adding a screener to the intake process to ensure we have the right people on the right wait list, looking at kind of a priority flag so that we can easily identify those individuals that would be prioritized with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. And then we also have an external project that's happening, which is an electronic referral system that would add required elements from a referral standpoint. So if a doctor is sending in one of these electronic referrals, it would require them to put in certain information like a diagnosis. And then we're looking at some process measures. So looking at the percentage of individuals that are referred that have a wait time less than 14 days, the number of new referrals we're getting on a monthly basis with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, and the percentage again, and then the percentage of appropriate flagged referrals. Okay, next slide, please. So we pulled data. We have an electronic health record system, and we pulled our data for the last, I guess, 2.5 years. So January of 2016 until October 31st of 2018. And we looked at the wait time in days from the time of referral to the time of their first appointment for individuals with a diagnosis of schizophrenia in Kitchener only. So of all those individuals that were accepted into service, we went back and captured what their wait time was. And our median wait time was 57.5 days over that period of 2.5 years. And if you go to the next slide, that one is the exact same data, but we just looked at it from this fiscal year. And the median wait time for this fiscal year alone was 52 days. Okay, next slide. We did a driver diagram. So our aim was to reduce the time of referral to service initiation. Primary drivers for that was this e-referral that I talked about that is outside of the scope and external to our project. But the other big primary driver was identifying clients with a diagnosis of schizophrenia at referral. And so change ideas were completing a clinical file review of new referrals weekly for a diagnosis of schizophrenia, to open an enrollment to track these clients and move them, or potentially move them to an internal wait list so that we can much more easily identify them. Adding a diagnosis to CaseWorks, which is our electronic health record system, and also using a community screener to identify treatment needs. So we started, if you go to the next slide, that's just a summary there, so we can skip that slide. So we started our first PDSA cycle back in January, which was adding a screener to the intake process. So highlights around this PDSA was we wanted to test the screener on our current waitlist clients to determine whether those individuals would get on the waitlist if we use this screener, and also whether the screener would identify individuals with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. So if you flip to the next slide, it will show the study part and what actually happened. So the screener actually didn't help us at all with this piece. It didn't work in the way we thought it would, and it didn't identify individuals with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. So we did the screener. We used the screener on the top 15 people on the wait list, the oldest referrals. Took over 15 minutes per client to discover a diagnosis. And diagnosis was not actually captured for 13 out of the 15 individuals. And if you had used the screener, only 2 clients at the time of referral would have actually made it to the wait list, and there were more than 2 clients that were actually appropriate for services. So what ended up happening was the screener went back to our system partners to be modified to actually make it more relevant and useful in that manner. The next PDSA that we did was looking at screening new referrals weekly to determine whether there was a diagnosis of schizophrenia so that we could then prioritize. We also wanted to look at whether the numbers of individuals with a priority criteria would warrant a separate wait list to try and manage, or if there are only like 1 or 2 in a week, that we could be able to manage those without having to add them to a separate wait list. And we also wanted to look at how this was going to impact staff workload by doing this screening of new referrals. So we flip to the next slide there. So what we found was that it was a timely process. We had low numbers of new referrals with the priority diagnosis of schizophrenia. And we had high numbers of incomplete referrals. So I think about 50% of the referrals were incomplete. So people were being added to the wait list without actually having all the information that we needed to put somebody into service. So that's creating a whole nother side project, I guess you could say, and looking at how do we make sure that information is there before somebody gets on a wait list. We also found through that process of screening referrals that many referrals were not actually eligible for service and they should have been referred to an alternate service. We also discussed the challenges with having a shared wait list, and that it's great if we want to prioritize individuals with the diagnosis of schizophrenia, but since it is a shared wait list, all of our partners should be agreeing to prioritize individuals in the same way. Or else there we're going to end up with all those clients coming to us. So actually doing this PDSA cycle number 2 actually came up with another change idea that we're going to explore further over the next month or two, and that's looking at the development of an actual referral package that we would ask to be completed at the initial end to ensure we're getting the right people on the wait list. The next slide. So we just so far have done 2 different change ideas. One has gone back, the first one has gone back to development again, so we will retest once that has been finalized, or we have a new draft version of that. And we're going to continue screening new referrals over the next couple of weeks and see kind of how that plays out. Next slide, please. So we talked about the outcome measures. So we're looking at the number of days waiting from referral to service initiation, which we can pull from our database. The percentage of individuals referred with a wait time less than 14 days. Again, this is within our database. Process measures are the number of new referrals on a monthly basis with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, and at this point we have to manually do that on a spreadsheet. The percentage of new referrals on a monthly basis with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, and the percentage of appropriately flagged referrals. So if they are being flagged with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, we want to ensure that that is, which we don't have set up yet. And then balancing measure is looking at the number of new referrals weekly, which again is a manual piece just to look at staff workload increase. And our next slide, just want to talk about some key overall challenges. So the biggest challenges that we have found in this whole project all along is the fact that there are system issues. We have a shared wait list, and that has been the biggest stumbling block, I think, for us as a team, and trying to wrap our head around how changes we make within our organization impact, or maybe don't impact, or should impact the other organizations, because theoretically we should all be using the same process. If it's a shared wait list, we should all have the same criteria for services. And we should all be using the same methodology for prioritizing clients. So one of the lessons learned on the next slide, well, it's actually a couple slides, but it's kind of an outcome of that, is what we would have done differently is we have 2 different processes happening. We have our QI project, our E-QIP project, but at the same time, there are system pieces happening with those 3 organizations that have the shared wait list, and there's processes happening there. And so I think if I could do this over again, I might wait until those pieces have been addressed, or work in closer partnership with what the system table is doing, so that we didn't feel like sometimes we were ahead of the curve.
What happened was we had a spin-off from this to those system tables.
Yes, we did end up, there was a positive thing about that, is that we ended up with a spin-off to another quality improvement project with that table, and they are actually looking at ways to improve their waitlist functionality, which is great. So what we're most excited about was just that the baseline data was better than we expected it would be. Addressing this issue of wait times will potentially address other wait time issues within our organization for other services. We do have strong organizational commitment to quality improvement. We are a system leader, and we do have some strong partnerships. So we are kind of leading the charge with some of our partners in some of those system improvements. And just this whole project to begin with has inspired other QI projects within the organization, which is really neat to see. So our next steps, continuing our change ideas and measuring our outcome data and seeing if there is an impact by implementing some of these change ideas, working with our service partners to adopt priority diagnosis of schizophrenia, and then linking that to our other priority criteria. So like I talked about our community treatment orders, transitional age use, and we have a couple of other priorities. So that's kind of about where we are with things right now. Are there questions?
Thank you, Jennifer. So I'm just going to check and see if we've got any questions that are coming up here. None so far. So the agencies that you're working with, they're receptive to having this package that you're talking about, this intake package?
That's what we need to have a conversation with the director within our organization that's part of that is taking that forward to that system. So I'm actually meeting with her tomorrow to talk about some of these ideas.
Oh, that's great. All right. Any other questions? You can type them in or raise your hand. The little raised hand is, oh, I see a raised hand. Hand is not raised. Nathaniel, did you have a question?
Hey, thanks for unmuting me. Thanks so much for the presentation, CMHA. In particular, you brought up needing to incorporate the new intake role. So although you had it and it started up and is helping make things more efficient, it wasn't really well integrated. And that is actually a really large theme that I'll be presenting on in my presentation. For your PDSA, how did you balance like the larger ideas of trying to do that integration with keeping those ideas manageable or keeping them doable?
So that's where we're just trying to kind of wrap our heads around those pieces. Is we just started with the reviewing those referrals to look at a diagnosis. So we'll so far it's been manageable in terms of the numbers coming in, but we have to obviously keep an eye on that. The other piece we're looking at doing it is when we talk about this referral package, that will actually potentially eliminate our need to review those referrals because the diagnosis will actually be captured at the front end. So when they're added to the wait list, we will already have that diagnosis, and then we can flag on the wait list that, hey, this individual has that diagnosis, so then the referral coordinator can just do a quick scan through the wait list and see those new priority referrals that have come through. Does that answer your question?
For sure. So it's looking at a lot of the administrative tasks that are going on in the background.
Yes,